Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's broadcast of the Monarch Joint Venture National Conservation Training Center Monarch Conservation Webinar Series. My name is Tracy McLeaf, and I'm a biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Conservation Training Center. And we're glad you could join us today for the first of two webinars we'll be broadcasting this month. Now I'd like to introduce you to Cora Lund Preston, the Communication Specialist at Monarch Joint Venture. Cora?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Tracy, and thanks, everyone here for joining us. As Tracy mentioned, my name is Cora Lund Preston with the Monarch Joint Venture. I'm also joined by Shelby from the Monarch Joint Venture. Today, Justin Meissen from the Tallgrass Prairie Center is with us to present on designing seed mixes for native habitat. Justin leads the Tallgrass Prairie Center Research and Restoration Program. He's responsible for implementing restoration research and projects, creating training seminars, presenting, and developing technical resources for many audiences. He has a PhD, he has a PhD in conservation biology from the University of Minnesota and a BS in integrative biology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Justin has worked professionally in restoration ecology and botany from North Carolina to California. And his PhD research at the University of Minnesota evaluated the risks of repeated intensive seed harvest from native tallgrass prairies. Justin is also an avid nature photographer whose work can be found throughout the web, particularly on his Flickr page. If you have any questions today during our presentation, Shelby and I will be monitoring the chat box where we encourage you to enter your questions. We'll have a Q&A at the end with Justin where we'll get to as many questions as we're able to get to. So now I'll turn it over to Justin to get us started.
All right. Great. Thank you, Cora. It's great to be here with everybody. As Cora said, I'm Justin Meissen. I run the Research and Restoration Program here at the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa in Cedar Falls. And today we're going to talk a little bit about designing native seed mixes for native habitat. So just to give you a bit of a roadmap here of the things that we're going to touch on in the next hour, we'll talk about what a seed mix is and what it should be designed to do. We'll talk about the underlying principles of designing seed mixes, talk about some of the tools that are out there that can help with the process, talk about the Iowa Prairie Seed Calculator, which integrates some of those seed mix design principles. And then I hope we might have a bit of a discussion about how we can improve seed mix design to make it easier to do and make sure we get the outcomes that we want in habitat restoration. So let's start with some of the basics here. What is a seed mix? Yeah, it's the mixture of seeds we sow in hopes of creating native habitat, but it's much more than that. Seed mixes are a primary tool that we have to design native plant communities. We get to choose which species to include, how much to include, and that all sort of creates the blueprint of the resulting plant community. Unlike a planting plan where we would have to grow and install like live plants, it's relatively easy to add or remove large quantities of seed from a mix sort of on the fly and make drastic alterations in the resulting planting if we need to. So basically, it's adaptable. Seed mix is also a restoration baseline. The goal of a restoration project really should never be to just plant X acres. We're always interested in the ecological outcomes. So the seed mix tells you what you planted, and then you can check back on that to compare whether the vegetation that you got was what you wanted. And ultimately, that helps identify what may or may not be working, and that can help you adapt your management or future seed mixes to sort of the realities on the ground. Then the seed mix is also a helpful project record. Helps us track costs of a project in terms of seed purchases, but again, as we're saying, gives us a way to look back at how planning is performed. Record keeping, unfortunately, is not usually a big priority for a lot of people, so if at least you can stash a seed mix in the project folder, it'll pay dividends later. So I'm going to keep touching on this theme of a seed mix as the blueprint for a native plant community. So again, the seed mix is not just a list of species that need to get planted. A seed mix has to act as a valid schematic for a native plant community that can exist in nature. So to give you an example, a seed mix designed to create pollinator habitat certainly has to include a lot of plants with high pollinator value. However, it can't just be composed of those species. So really our job when designing seed mixes has to be about creating a self-sustaining native plant community, which means that we have to incorporate all the species that play a role in a given ecosystem. And this is one of the basic tenets of ecological restoration set forth by the Society for Ecological Restoration to create a self-sustaining system as much as we can. Okay, so let's talk about how we can design a seed mix with all of this in mind. So what are some of these ecological and practical principles that can help us? So really broadly, there are a couple of key things to consider when we're putting together a seed mix. The first and very important is species selection. So what plant species we should include in the mix. The next one is seeding rates. So once we know what species we want to include, the question is how much seed should we plant for each species. Then on the more practical side, we want to think about what kind of nurse crops we might want to include. Basically, these can help stabilize the planting site as our native species are getting established. And then lastly, we want to think about availability. So what seeds can we actually obtain? How might we work within the constraints of budgets and markets to ensure that we still plant a good seed mix? So let's look at species selection first. So when we're choosing which species should go in a mix, we want to make sure that each species, as well as the assemblage of species we choose, meets the following criteria. So the first criteria, species we select should be able to grow on our planting site. And by that I mean we want to make sure that they're geographically appropriate, basically that they're native to the general region, that they're appropriate for the soil and moisture conditions on our site, and that they can tolerate the light conditions where they're planted. Next, the species that we select should comprise a functioning plant community when taken together. So when we look at our species list, we want to make sure that we have species representing a broad spectrum of functional diversity, lifespans, and phenology. So basically, diversity in our species selection is really crucial. And then finally, we do want to make sure the species that we choose are going to help us meet any specific conservation goals or habitat objectives that we might have. So we want to make sure if we have a target organism or a group of organisms that we want to support, we should make sure that our seed mix can do that. So let's look more in depth at this idea of selecting geographically appropriate species. So the underlying idea here is that we want to plant species, the underlying idea in general here is that plant species are adapted to broad ecological conditions, and we want to make sure those match our planting site. So let's talk a bit about some of these underlying concepts that we should consider when we're evaluating whether a species is geographically appropriate. So first of all, not surprisingly, temperature is a big determining factor as to which species are going to grow where. Length of growing season and species tolerance to cold are some of those underlying drivers of what's going to grow. Usually latitude or elevation, once you get farther into the west and with more mountains, will determine this. So to give you an example of how different plant species really can be in terms of their temperature preferences, we've got prairie brome up on the top here in the top right and big blue stem on the bottom. So prairie brome is a cool season grass that's generally found only in colder regions. So the northeast and the northern tallgrass prairies. You'll also notice that it's found in the Black Hills of South Dakota. So here's an example of elevation playing a role along with latitude. And we could contrast that with big bluestem, which grows in an incredibly large range of temperature conditions, from the Gulf Coast to Maine to Arizona. So a very big contrast. Another broad driver in determining where species are going to thrive is precipitation. So how tolerant or intolerant are species to dry conditions? For much of North America, longitude's a pretty good proxy for this, but of course rain shadows and oceanic factors can make it quite a lot more complex in the west. So here's an example of how two closely related species are adapted to different precipitation regimes. So purple prairie clover up on top here, it's found throughout much of the Great Plains, but it's also found in more moist conditions east of the Mississippi and sort of gets into the eastern part of the tallgrass prairie. Nine-anther prairie clover, on the other hand, is only generally found in drier regions, though, so farther west, mostly in the shortgrass prairies, and only in the very extreme western part of the tallgrass prairie, in the Luss Hills of Iowa, sort of as far east as that one gets. So how can we figure out whether a species is geographically appropriate? So the two main sources are based on range maps from documented specimens or from floras from various regions. So my favorite resource that we use a lot at the Tallgrass Prairie Center here is the BONAP website, which is the Biota of North America program. They've got a pretty comprehensive species list, and you can pull up the range maps for each species to see where each species has been documented on a county-by-county basis. So in the upper right, that species would likely be geographically appropriate to include in a mix anywhere in Iowa, most of Minnesota, Missouri, Illinois, but probably not appropriate for Tennessee or Georgia. And you can also use your regional flora. We tend to use the flora of the Great Plains here in Iowa, but there's a flora for most regions or states, and each species will have a range description that can help you figure out what its distribution is. Another important topic when selecting species for seed mixes has to do with making sure that the species we include can grow in the soils and moisture regimes on our planting site. So once we know that a species is geographically appropriate, then we need to figure out whether it's soil and moisture appropriate. So generally, most species grow best in either dry, mesic, or wet sites. So dry adapted species tend to do well on sort of gravelly, sandy, or thin soils, coarse soils that lose moisture pretty fast. And species that are adapted to more mesic soils, they tend to do better in sort of moderate soil moisture conditions, where it's neither very dry or very wet. In the Midwest, these are mostly loamy and deep soils, and they're also, for the most part, prime agricultural soils as well. So more mesic species in the tallgrass prairie region would be Indian grass or common milkweed. Then species adapted to wetter conditions, they tend to do best in hydric soils, where you expect some amount of temporary saturation and a high water table. So how do we figure out how to match the species in our seed mix to the soils on the planting site? You can find soil maps pretty easily nowadays on an RCS web soil survey, and that'll give you a summary of the soil types pretty much in any defined area. So you can figure out if you've got a dry site, which would be soils that are excessively drained, A mesic site, which would have soils that range from somewhat poorly drained to somewhat excessively drained, or if it's a wet site, that would be probably poorly or very poorly drained soils. So then once we know our soils, we can start matching species using regional floras once again. So most species descriptions in these floras will have a habitat description included, and often it'll say whether it tends to be found on dry outcrops or wet meadows, or something more mesic and nondescript, like open ground. We always want to tailor our mixes to the soils as much as possible, but sometimes sites can have complex soils where it can be kind of impractical to try to design 3 or 4 mixes just for a single small site. So in cases like this, sometimes it's best to take what we call a shotgun approach, where we design a mix that might include both dry, mesic, and wet species all in the same mix, with the idea being that those species that are adapted to the soils where they land are going to establish well, while the poorly adapted species die. So that's not efficient, but sometimes it is more feasible than individually mixing and designing multiple mixes. Another thing to think about when selecting species is what the light levels at a site are and what species are best adapted to those light levels. So for example, if you're restoring a site that's open, make sure to use prairie or grassland species. If it's semi-shaded, use savanna or shrubland species, and woodland or forest species if it's very shaded. Again, we can go back to our regional floras that give us information about sort of these general habitat and light requirements in the habitat descriptions. And for some species, native plant growers actually have some recommendations sometimes if the species is commonly used in horticultural settings. Let's see. So another key idea is that we want to use here when we're choosing species for our seed mix is that we want to make sure that our selections comprise a spectrum of functional diversity. So this is at the heart of designing seed mixes that produce quality native vegetation long term. So a functional group is essentially a set of species that share some ecologically meaningful trait. So the nitrogen-fixing legumes, that's a good example of that. In general, the more functional groups or functional diversity that you have, the more resilient a plant community is going to be. Basically, it's able to self-stabilize even with disturbance. So very broadly, in grassland systems at least, there are 2 very general groups, functional groups or guilds, graminoids and forbs. So we should make sure that our mix has a diverse selection of both. But within each of these guilds, it's important to capture the diversity and variety of both groups. So we want to make sure to include both cool and warm season grasses, as well as any sedges or rushes that would be appropriate to the site. Same goes for the forbs. We want to capture a large variety of them, especially making sure to include a diversity of legume species and other forb species. Along a similar vein, we also want to select species that comprise a spectrum of lifespans. So short-lived species are important to include because those tend to be good colonizers, which mean they'll establish quickly to provide cover in those first few growing seasons. And once the planting is fully established, they can also help recolonize disturbed areas down the line. But we also want to include long-lived species as well. These species are often slow to establish, so it'll take a few growing seasons before they're fully mature. But they provide the long-term structure to the plant community, and they're often the species that give us reliable ecological benefits through time. So another target to aim for when selecting species is to capture a wide spectrum of phenologies in bloom times. So making sure that we add spring, summer, and fall flowering species. So if you're familiar with the CP42 CRP program, the pollinator program, this is already one of the requirements for that, and I think it's a good one. The idea here basically is that we want to provide floral resources throughout the entire year as much as possible. And lastly, we want to include plant species that will play a role in achieving specific conservation goals. So for example, we want to make sure we include host plants for invertebrates, obviously milkweeds for monarchs, some other butterflies as well, lupin for Carner blues, bird's foot violets for regal fritillaries. And we also want to make sure that we have habitat plants also. Bunch grasses for bumblebee nests, hollow stem species, which might include species in the carrot family, for example, for some small bees. But as important as it is to make sure that these species are included, we should not lose focus of the fact that our seed mix needs to be designed to produce a stable native plant community. So simply planting fields of one or two specific goal-oriented species, that is not going to be sustainable in the long term. Again, we have to make sure all of our functional groups are covered and that we design a plant community that includes and supports our goal-oriented species but does not over-prioritize them. Okay, so now that we've covered what species we should include in our mixes, let's talk about seeding rates, or how much of each species we should put in a mix. So in general, we want our seeding rates to reflect the long-term vegetation structure that we hope to achieve. So there's a couple considerations with this. So figuring out what our overall seeding rate is going to be, what rates each functional group should be sown at, and what the seeding rates for individual species should be. Another consideration when thinking about seeding rates is that we will have to take our budget into account. So cost considerations and how we can work within those constraints. And then finally, how and when we plant is also going to determine our seeding rate. So sowing time and planting method being the main considerations. So looking at overall seeding rates, what we mean here is basically how many seeds per square foot should our custom mix contain. So we want to aim for the lowest rate that produces a diverse and resilient plant community. And the reason we want to do this is because increasing the seeding rate does not efficiently result in more plants. So the higher our rate, the lower our establishment success. And so that's what the graph in the upper right is showing. Basically, this means that we're paying a lot for seeds and for more seeds, but the chance that each seed turns into a plant gets lower when we increase the seeding rate. So cost effectiveness goes down when we overshoot our seeding rates. Really, there needs to be more research on figuring out what the lowest effective rates are, but there are some estimates out there in the literature. In tallgrass prairies, for example, we tend to shoot for 30 to 50 seeds per square foot. Arid lands, it's a bit less, and temperate forests, it's even less than that. Okay, so once we decide on an overall rate, we should think about how it can be portioned up with regard to functional groups. So one of the more contentious questions in prairie seed mix design has to do with the ideal grass to forb seeding rates. At Tallgrass Prairie Center here, we've done some research on this. We found that adding too much grass results in grass-dominated stands. So, for example, if we seeded at 40 seeds per square foot and then 30 seeds of that was grass. On the flip side, too much forb seed tends to lead to poor establishment and abundance of weeds. Our best results were basically with a more balanced mix, so about 50% of the mix being grass and forbs. But again, it's crucial that within these broad guilds we include a diversity of functional groups like sedges, cool season grasses, and warm season grasses. Okay, so let's talk about setting seeding rates for individual species. So our seeding rates should more or less reflect what we hope to see in the plant community down the line. but we should also take general establishment tendencies into account. So native seeds in general don't establish very well when we plant them into field conditions. Most prairie species, we rarely see species that top 20% establishment success. It's been our experience that 5 to 10% establishment is usually a pretty good expectation from a native seed mix. There are often some species that are particularly good or bad establishers. So good contrast would be big blue stem, which does have that close to 20% establishment rate, compared to prairie drop seed, which has a really low rate of, barely tops 1% often. In a general, but by no means definitive guideline to likely establishment success, is that smaller seeded species tend to have lower establishment than large seeded species. And when it comes to sticking within the budget, it's common that a few species are going to be a lot more expensive than others, but we should keep them in the mix. Just lower the seeding rates. So that way there's still a chance that they'll show up. So lower the rate, don't eliminate. So planting time is also important to take into account for seeding rates. This is mostly based on our experience in the tallgrass prairies, so your mileage might vary if you're listening in from west of the Rockies or the south. But for us, the growing season is usually mostly tied to temperature. And so the general gist of this is that some species are going to perform better or worse based on when they're planted. Forbs often need cold, moist stratification to break seed dormancy, and so planting in the fall helps with that. But in the fall, some grasses, though, tend to germinate early and die, and so increasing the seeding rate can alleviate some of those losses. And then lastly, we want to adjust our seeding rates to account for planting methods. Basically, it comes down to how efficient is the planting method in getting seeds to have good seed-to-soil contact. So broadcast seeding tends to be pretty inefficient, and increasing the seeding rate can counteract that. Drilling with a native seed drill, that's quite efficient on the other hand. So we don't usually need to make any changes to rates when we use that. Real briefly here, just want to point out that native seed mixes usually should include a nurse crop, especially if we're planting into bare soil. So these help stabilize the site while our natives are getting established. Generally, they'll fade out after a couple of years. Common cover crops in the Midwest tend to be oats for the spring, or winter wheat in the fall. But the best cover crop for the job will probably be different as you start moving out of the Midwest. All right, so our last principle here is that we want to design our mixes with seed availability in mind. So we want to make sure that we can send it to a native seed producer and order exactly what we need. So far we've been talking about designing mixes in seeds per square foot. But seed producers don't need to know that. They just need to know the quantity of seed that you want. So after we design a mix in seeds per square foot, we need to convert to ounces or pounds using the area of our planting site and the size of seeds. And this is one of the reasons why it's so nice to use the seed mix calculator tool. Now when you're placing an order, we always want to be buying in PLS seed or pure live seed. This is the pure viable seed in the seed lot. Bulk seed might have very low purity or many unviable seeds, meaning that there could be a lot of chaff or dead seeds in a batch. So PLS takes that into account so we can sow the amount of seed that we specified in the design process. Some species might be unavailable from seed growers, and sometimes they'll suggest a substitute species. In general, try to avoid this. So try a different producer, or if they do have species that fill the same functional role and meets all the geographic and soil criteria for the mix, then we can use that as a substitute. Now here in Iowa, we have a pretty well-developed native seed industry, so we can usually purchase the seed that we need for habitat restorations. However, that might not be the case for you. So if you have trouble finding seed commercially, wild harvest can be a viable option, though you do tend to lose precision in the design process since it's harder to obtain clean, viable seed. One thing to keep in mind is if you happen to be in one of those underdeveloped native seed markets, is that enough consistent requests for species could encourage growers to develop and sell those plant materials. Okay, so now that we've covered the principles of seed mix design, let's briefly cover some of the tools that are out there that you can use to make it easier. So the most basic tool is the spreadsheet. These provide a lot of freedom to make our own choices, and the strength here is in basically just helping to structure the design process and do the calculations and conversions needed. It is still somewhat of a blank canvas, and you need to be comfortable with your regional flora and ecology to go through the species selection process, basically what we've been talking about previously. So an example of this is the Xerxes Society Seed Mix Calculator. This is a nice sort of framework that's available on their website, and it's a pretty good tool that is basic but still useful. Then there are some other more involved spreadsheet-based calculators out there. These tend to make it easier to go through the species selection process, since they usually have species lists sort of baked into the spreadsheet. The main downside here, at least in our experience with these, is that they tend to be very program-specific. And so unless you're trying to, for example, design an Iowa CRP planting or a roadside in Colorado, it can be kind of confusing. So examples out there, Colorado DOT has one for those of you in the shortgrass prairie area. Nebraska Pheasants Forever's got a seed mix calculator. Like we were saying, Iowa and Wisconsin, NRCS has a seed mix calculator, and so does Minnesota. Okay, so another tool for seed mix design is our own Iowa Prairie Seed Mix Calculator. So what we've done is incorporated sort of these principles of seed mix design that we've talked about so far into what I hope is a user-friendly interface that takes some of the guesswork out of the process of seed mix design. So for example, we include geographically appropriate species in the tool. We incorporate soil moisture and functional groups. And we have some tweaks that account for planting method and timing. So let me show you how all of this works. And so we're going to go ahead and bring up the website here. And so we'll go ahead and just type, we'll head to the Tallgrass Prairie Center first. And we've got a link to the seed mix calculator right on the main page. And so this is the Prairie Seed Calculator. So this is what you'll see when you get here. And each, we have sort of review if you want to sort of look at some of these principles before you embark on your design. But let's jump right into the calculator so that we can show you how it works. So we will start with an example here. And so what we're going to do is create a dry music mix. The idea here, we want to create a good mix, but we don't want to spend a ton of time customizing it. So that is going to be our first sort of scenario. So let's say that our soil moisture is dry mesic, so it's kind of dry, but not particularly wet, probably in the somewhat excessively drained category. We're going to go ahead and drill it into bare soil in the fall, and we'll just do 1 acre, and we will set this for Lyon County, which is in the far northwestern part of the state, and so this mix might also be something that you could use pretty confidently in sort of southwestern Minnesota or southeastern South Dakota. We're going to do premium for the cost factor. So just a note here, we have these tooltips that you can click on that show you what all this really means. And here we're going to not include optional species, and this will make more sense as to what this means when we do a second example. So we're going to go ahead and calculate it. And this is our custom seed mix. So what we have here, what's happened is we've generated a seed mix, and here is sort of the parameters that we've set. Again, it's just sort of a review of what we decided we wanted. And here we've got the information on the cover crop that we want to use and the rates. Let's see here. I think we've got maybe a little snafu. So let's, Cora is saying that we might want to go back to the slides. Okay, so let's, all right, so you guys did not see any of that. So what we're going to do is walk you through sort of a static version of it. So basically what all I just said, I'll just point out really quickly some of the things. This up top here is the some of the places that you can learn more about how the calculator works. Each drop down here will let you choose each kind of seeding site, and here is a these if you click on these will bring up the tooltips. So let's keep moving along here. So back where I left off. So so what we have here is basically, again, this review of what we chose. Down here is where we have our cover crop recommendations. And we also are showing the species, total species that we have, and estimate of the cost. So the cost is a little bit outdated, but I would say in 2017 we might want to think about using the very most expensive estimations, and seed prices, at least in Iowa, have gone up quite a lot. Okay, so here is, this is also part of the calculator, some of the output that you get. So we have basically the name of the species, scientific name, the seeding rate, the ounces PLS, like we were talking about, and a cost range for each. And so as you can see, we've got cool season grasses, so we're breaking these out by functional groups so that we know we've got those covered. We've got our legumes, and for each group, general group, we have a summation of seeds per square foot. And what we can do is we can go in and change each one of these seeding rates and then recalculate based on that. And we can go ahead and do that on the fly. Forbs, you can see, very diverse range of things that we've generated here. Again, with the option to go through and change anything. Okay, so this is towards the very bottom of the page when you do generate your seed mix. So now we're looking at grand totals. So we've got 66 species in here. We've got a really high seeding rate, right, because we're seeding in the fall, and so we've increased our seeding rate for the grasses. It's also a premium mix, so we're not so concerned about cost in this particular circumstance, and so we have a general cost estimate here for the whole mix. Now at this point, if that looks good to us, we can go ahead and go to the Print Custom Mix, and what that'll do is give us something that we can import to Excel or print off and send right to a native seed mix grower, and so they can give you a bid price, and this can help you sort of get your seed faster and more efficiently. And again, we have our cover crop recommendations as well. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do one more example. This is going to be a little different. We're going to be planting into mesic soil conditions. Still going to be drilling. Again, bare soil. This time we're going to plant in the spring, and we are going to be a little more cost conscious, and so we're going to choose the economy factor. But for this particular exercise, we're going to include optional species, and so what this is going to do is basically show us the full list of species that are geographically and soil moisture appropriate to the site, potential site, based on everything that we've shown. So again, we see here that we've changed our cover crop to oats because it's in the spring. We can see we've got fewer species now, but it's also cheaper. And okay, so let's take a look at some of these species. So what we see here is that we don't have this included in the base mix, but if we wanted to, say we did want this species, because it showed up, we know that it is geographically and soil moisture appropriate, so we could add it in and reasonably expect it to do well if we wanted. So we could change that to 1 or whatever to the seeding rate that we wanted to do. Same with the forbs, same with legumes. And what we'll see at the end again, so now if we look at our seeding rate, it's closer to that 40 seeds per square foot. That tends to be sort of the minimum, or close to the minimum, and that is the sort of the summation of our work. So the other interesting thing I think that our seed mix calculator produces is you can look at, for Iowa at least, the vendor contact information. This will show you a list of and contact info for different seed growers, so you know who to send bids to. Okay, so that is sort of an overview of the Iowa Prairie Seed Calculator. But there's sort of a first version. We're still working on it. We want to improve it, and so I think what we've been thinking about at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. Some of the areas we see that could be improved, sort of broader application. We would like to try to incorporate more species, more regions to, cover sort of the whole Tallgrass Prairie region, or at least sort of Iowa and surrounding states. It's also helpful to look at selection guidance, sometimes additional information in terms of the species can be useful. Now, I think in general, seed mix design tools, including ours, can be further improved by making them more user-friendly, incorporating more expert opinion, and making them applicable to more regions. But we also want to know what you guys think. What tools do you currently use? How would you like to see them improve if you do use one? What are your biggest barriers to designing seed mixes? So I think hopefully we'll have some time to talk about this at the end here. But if not, please send me an email. We want to keep making seed mix design more accessible. So with that, I'd like to thank the creators of our seed mix calculator, Jim Meissen, Dave Williams, Greg Houseel, and we thank the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture for helping out with funding. And at this point, I will open it up to questions and discussion. I think we got ended about 2 minutes early.
That's great. Thank you, Justin, for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thanks again to everyone who's listening. We're really glad you're here. We're going to take the next few minutes to ask some of the questions that came through during the webinar. Feel free to keep asking questions, and we will get to whatever we have time for today. We did also record today's webinar, so if you want to share it or come back and watch it again, it will be available online on the Monarch Joint Venture and NCTC websites as soon as it's available. And one more housekeeping note, we will follow up after today's webinar with a list of resources from the Tallgrass Prairie Center and a short survey for you to complete, sharing any feedback you have on the webinar and on our webinar series. And we would love to hear from you. So we might not get through all the questions, but we will do our best here, and we will get started with Justin, you mentioned some wild harvesting or local collecting of seeds, and I was wondering if you could touch on what are some of the important considerations that people would have to take into account before doing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is a subject near and dear to my heart. I spent 5 years working on this. And yeah, so some of the things that you want to think about when you're collecting species from the wild to make sure that you don't deplete those populations. So one of the most important things is population size. So you always want to avoid collecting seed from small populations. The larger the population, the better. There's also genetic reasons that that's a good thing as well. Some other things to consider, what is the life history of the species? So short-lived species and non-clonal species, so plants that rely on seed to reproduce and persist, those tend to be more at risk of depletion than clonal or long-lived species. So those are pretty good rules of thumb that you can use. In general, at least in the Tallgrass Prairie, we've found that annual harvest is too much. And something that does seem to be more sustainable is 50% harvest every 3 years, which is a higher estimation than some other authors have suggested. But I think it's for the Tallgrass Prairie. I think it makes sense given that we have so many long-lived clonal species.
Great, thank you. Along a similar vein, you mentioned short-lived and early successional species. Are there negative effects to planting a high percentage of those early successional species for the long-term health of a restoration?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's always really nice to come out a year or two later and see just a bonanza of flowers.
Yeah.
But the sort of what tends to happen is that those plants tend to sort of fade out, and they get replaced by other species. And so the other species are those long-lived species. So it's sort of a trade-off, sort of passing the baton. Mm-hmm. And when you don't have those long-lived species to take up that space, at least what we've been seeing so far, I think we'll get better data next year. But it seems to be more weeds that tend to colonize the site. It is important to think about your own sort of ecosystems and plant communities, because there are certainly native plant communities out there that are short-lived communities, like annual grasslands are one example. But in the tallgrass prairie, you can have issues with sort of going too heavy on the short-lived species.
Okay, that's really interesting. Another similar question, can you comment on the pros and cons of doing high diversity mixes with a small number of species versus moderately diverse with more of each species mixed?
Let's see. So if I'm getting the question right, it is so we want to know if we can do what the difference between a high diversity, low species. I'm confused here.
Sure, sorry. So if you have a high diversity mix, there aren't going to be as many seeds per species.
I see.
And what would be the pros or cons of doing that versus a less diverse mix with more of each species?
Yes. So, of course, the pros for using a fewer species but higher rates is that you tend to get that tends to be more cost-effective in terms of just getting plants on the ground. Assuming, of course, that you've gone through the species selection process, and that that the species that you plant are going to do well. Sometimes, so some of the drawbacks to that. So if we are just focusing on a couple species, sometimes we are missing out on some of those functional groups. I think at the very minimum, if you have sort of a lower diversity but high functional diversity, that would be sort of the best trade-off. I mean, there's tons of research and literature out there just showing how beneficial just having many native species are. But of course, yes, you're right. It's not always practical. And so when you do find yourself in sort of a crunch, I think the next best step is to take an approach in terms of the functional side of things.
Yeah, that makes sense. You also mentioned, not going overboard with planting only milkweed or what have you, and only plants that are intended to serve as food for a particular species. And I know the Tallgrass Prairie Center has done some research on how many forbs versus grasses to plant. But is there kind of a general rule of thumb as to how many pollinator plants versus other plants to include that you could comment on?
Yeah, so it's sort of our estimation at this point that including somewhere in the 50% range of forbs to grasses, and all the, generally speaking, most of those forbs are going to be good pollinator plants. It can be, I think one thing that we've thought about, and that we've planted a pollinator planting that we did a 60-40, so we planted 60% forbs and 40% grass. So we'll see how that goes. But in terms of the research, 50-50 tends to be pretty good, with the exception, with the caveat that 50% of grass really needs to be diverse. And so, we can't just have 50% of it big blue stem, or 50% of it little blue stem. It needs to be, sort of the underlying fear of the, trying to make a pollinator mix, a good pollinator mix, and avoiding a lot of the grasses is that a lot of the mixes tend to be just 20 seeds per square foot of switchgrass, and so it's important that we keep the seeding rates for the individual species low. But as a collective, they should probably make up close to 50%.
Great. We also had a few questions about more information about some of the resources that are out there. One of those was, are you aware of any seed mix planning tools that take management constraints into account, like you're not able to burn or things like that?
That's really interesting. I don't know of any, but so I guess one thing I will share from our research is the importance of mowing, at least in sort of areas that get sufficient moisture, like most of the Midwest. It's really helpful to be out there mowing every, whenever the weeds get to about knee high, and going through a mowing at about 4 inches. That really increases the vigor of the native seedlings. And so in terms of a seed mix, you might actually be able to get away with fewer, lower seeding rates as long as you're out there mowing really religiously.
Yeah. Good. Do you have recommendations for where people can go to find good seed sources?
Yeah, let's see. That one is a little tough for me without knowing exactly where everybody's coming from.
Sure.
I can point you to, of course, the Iowa Seed Calculator with the vendor information for Iowa producers. Grand Prairie Friends, grandprairiefriends.org is a nonprofit out of Illinois. That website has some native seed nurseries. I'm not sure how current that list is, but it's, I think, pretty comprehensive. That tends to cover most of the Midwest. I'm afraid I don't have very many suggestions for folks outside of the Midwest, but it's, yeah.
That's a good starting point. No, thank you. I'll also point out that for milkweed and monarch plants, the Monarch joint venture website for folks is a good place to go. And if you can get to our page about information about creating habitat by just going to plantmilkweed.org.
Actually, yeah, I came up with one more.
Great.
In Iowa, we have Plant Iowa Native. That is plantiowa.native.org. You can find it on our website, or actually, we'll send that to you guys in the links later.
Great. That's great. And then another kind of resource question was about, is there a guide that you would recommend for finding out how long-lived species are and which ones require cold stratification? Would that be in the flora guides that you were mentioning earlier?
Sometimes it is. Yeah, so it's interesting, like, lifespan is, in my opinion, it's really important, but it's also kind of hard to measure,
Sure.
It's not, it's hard to track plants for, especially these prairie species that can live for 30, 40 years. So, I don't know of any really good authoritative sources outside of the scientific literature, but floras will definitely tell you whether a species is perennial or biennial or annual, and of course the annuals and biennials are definitely short-lived.
Sure.
And a lot of the times you can get good clues from that.
Okay. That is great. Well, rather than dive into another question, 1:59 in our time here, so we will wrap up. I just want to say thank you again to Justin and the Tallgrass Prairie Center. Thanks to NCTC for hosting our webinar series, and thanks to everyone here for participating. We hope to see you on our next webinar, which will be next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, which is Designing and Creating Outdoor Signs for Monarch Habitat. So we hope to see you all again, and thanks again, everyone. Goodbye.